insisted they wanted to talk to Marlene herself. A man parked beside the catering table, loudly accusing someone of pocketing the event money. Right in the middle of the chaos, someone yanked the power cord to the speakers. The music died halfway through the song, and a strange hush washed over the whole place. Marlene clapped sharply, trying to reel things back in, calling it a harmless tech issue and begging every Anito stay for the evening paddleboarding session. But the mood had shifted. It wasn't a celebration anymore. The IT was falling apart piece by piece. I stayed on my porch, watching silently, letting the whole mess fold in on the weight of her own lies. As the sun slid down and the sky burned orange, a sheriff's deputy pulled into the drive. Not the same one as before, thankfully. This one had that calm, steady presence of someone who didn't pick favorites. He stepped onto my land, introduced himself politely, and asked if he could talk to me about the complaints his office had received from attendees. I invited him in, showed him the ownership paperwork, the evidence folder, and the screenshots from the fake rental listing. I even played him the trail cam clip off the assistant trying my cabin door. That he nodded, took notes, and said he had a Nauto file and incident report. I asked if anything would actually come from it. He told me it depended on whether the victims wanted to press charges. At least one of them was already drafting a statement. Outside, most guests were trickling away, some driving off without a word, others already on the phone with their banks. Marlene stood near the dock, arms crossed tight, yelling at a man rolling up the banners. I could hear her through the trees, her voice high and cracking, demanding to know who unplugged the music and why people were leaving before dessert. I wondered how long she could keep pretending nothing was wrong. That illusion was almost gone. By the time the last car left, the event grounds looked like a carnival that had deflated overnight. Trash in the grass, half-eaten sandwiches on paper plates, plastic cups drifting near the shoreline. I sat in the porch until night settled, flipping through the folder. Everything was finally aligning. Guests were talking, screenshots were spreading. My cameras had earned their keep. I had proof of lies, trespassing, fake advertising, and personal profit disguised as community effort. And best of all, I had the bylaw clause that allowed the HOA board to remove her. The final step would be presenting everything at the next board meeting. But evidence wasn't enough. That IT needed momentum. And after today, the tide had finally started turning. When the stars came out and the last echoes of her disaster faded, I locked my cabin door and smiled. She had thrown everything she could at me. Fake citations, rumors, intimidation, and now her own lies were collapsing on her. The guests were gone. The cabin was locked, and the truth was about to be louder than any speaker system she could ever plug in. The next morning, after Marlene's event fell apart, I stepped outside to find a fresh violation notice duct taped to my mailbox. Bigger than the last, printed in all caps. Unauthorized perimeter barrier and obstruction of community sight lines. That I almost laughed. The gate on my driveway had been there for years, long before I bought the place. That IT was in the original listing photos. But since charm and intimidation had failed, she was now trying to bury me in paperwork. I tore the notice down, added it to the bulging folder, and made a pot of coffee while scrolling through the flood of messages that came in overnight. The woman who confronted Marlene about the fake cabin listing had posted a detailed account in the community's private group that IT spread fast. She included screenshots of messages from the assistant who took her money and disappeared once the event fell apart. Other guests chimed in, saying they also paid through back-channel methods. One said Marlene even offered a discount if they didn't ask for a receipt. I saved every screenshot, every comment, every reply. Hour by hour, the evidence stack grew. People were connecting the dots. That IT wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. Later, a new twist arrived at a man I had never met pulled up in a black pickup and introduced himself as a contractor who worked on the lodge last summer. He saw the post about the fake listing and decided it was time to speak up. Marlene still owed him nearly $3,000 and blamed budget issues. When he pushed, he tried getting the board involved but never got a response. I offered him coffee on the porch. We compared timelines, and it was Clersh been using her role to funnel favors without any official approval. That he agreed to write a formal statement and promised to testify. If needed, that I added his report to the folder and sent a copy to my lawyer, who replied almost immediately. That's the nail in the coffin. That I spent the rest of the day walking the property with a notepad and checking the cameras. One caught someone creeping around the back of the cabin at midnight. Hoodie, gloves, careful movements, tampering with the irrigation line. Sure enough, one hose had been cut clean through. Not an accident. I printed stills and put them in an envelope labeled Sabotage. Then I backed everything up on a thumb drive and mailed it to my lawyer, just in case something happened to the original. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I sat on the porch watching the lake shimmer. A neighbor named Paula stopped by with a casserole and a smile. She said she saw everything online and wanted to show her support. Her father had been on the original board and would be disgusted by what it had become. We ate pasta on the porch and shared stories of Marlene's bullying. Paula remembered when Marlene accused a retired veteran of hoarding junk because he covered his vintage motorcycle with a tarp in his driveway. She handed me a list of names, people willing to speak out. The more voices, the harder it would be for Marlene to twist anything. The next morning, I received an envelope from the county zoning office. Inside was the official confirmation that my property was outside HOA jurisdiction. Boundary maps, deed references, certification sealed. I made 3 copies, laminated one, and taped it inside my front window. Then I dropped another copy in Marlene's mailbox with a sticky note reading, "Cease all false claims." That I knew she'd lose her mind. Good. Let her taste some of the helplessness she had spread for years. That afternoon, a crowd gathered outside the HOA office for an emergency meeting. That I wasn't a member, but thanks to my evidence and the witnesses willing to testify, I had been invited to speak. Aunt Ruth arrived in a linen suit with a briefcase of old notes and a smile like she'd waited years for this. Inside, tension hung like humidity. Marlene sat at the head of the table with her usual cold composure, but her fingers twitched nervously as she shuffled her agenda. That I walked in with Ruth and several neighbors. People whispered. Phones recorded. The room felt different. Finally, when it was my turn, I laid the folder on the table and explained everything. The fake listing, the trespassing, the sabotage, the payments, the deception, screenshots, videos, receipts, testimonies. That I read the removal clause in the bylaws. This wasn't personal anymore. It was abuse of power and fraud. I turned to Marlene as she fumbled through shaky denials, blaming rogue volunteers, but her voice wavered. The mask was gone. Then the woman who tried to rent my cabin stood and shared her story. How betrayed she felt, how much she lost, how Marlene treated her like the problem. When she finished, silence filled the room. Even Marlene's defenders stared down at the table. Aunt Ruth stood next, reading a list of buried violations. Everyone tied back to Marlene or her inner circle. The contractor ended the testimonies with unpaid invoices, timelines, and unanswered emails. He didn't want revenge, just honesty and payment for his work. By the end, Marlene had no fight left. A board member called for a vote. Hands rose one by one, even the hesitant ones. Unanimous. Marlene was removed immediately. She stood pale, silent, and walked out without a single word. And I watched her go with a mix of relief and disbelief. It was over. After weeks of battles, the door finally closed. The lake felt quiet again. The next morning was unlike any other since I arrived. No fake citations, no HOA patrols, no shouting from the dock. Just warm, peaceful silence. That I sat with coffee on the porch, breathing like I finally could. The whole atmosphere felt different, like the storm had passed and the sky remembered how to be blue. Later, I received a formal letter from the new acting president, Nain, soft-spoken, steady. She thanked me for my patience and invited me to serve as a liaison between the board and non-HOA residents. The tea first I nearly tossed out of habit, but paused. Maybe it was an olive branch. Maybe they were trying to rebuild. I folded the letter and set it aside. I'd think about it. Word of Marlene's removal spread fast. By evening, neighbors I'd never met were stopping by, shaking my hand, dropping off small gifts. Joel brought apples. Denise offered to repaint my dock fence. Someone said they finally felt comfortable putting wind chimes back up after years of them being banned. The ripple effect of her downfall was real that I walked through the retreat grounds. The failed event space. The banner was gone, tables cleared, lanterns stacked in a corner. But the place looked exhausted, like it had carried too much that I picked up litter, stood by the water. The lake shimmered softly. Recovering that I realized I no longer felt the instinct to look over my shoulder. The weight was gone that a local reporter called about the situation that I declined to go on record. This wasn't about attention. But I gave her documents so Marlene couldn't pull this elsewhere. That night, I hosted another barbecue, but this one was different. No strategy, no tension. Just neighbors, food, laughter, and a night free of fear. Someone brought a guitar. Someone brought pee. It felt like the lake was becoming what it was always meant to be. Near the end, Aunt Ruth pulled me aside, said she was proud of how I handled everything. She gave me a faded photograph off the lake from decades ago. Wooden chairs on the dock. Fishermen, kids splashing the shallows, and rules. No citations, just community. She said too. Keep it close. That's what this place used to stand for. In the days that followed, small changes appeared everywhere. Fences got fresh paint. Wind chimes returned. Garden gnomes reemerged. The family hung a tree swing that had once been denied. And Nain sent a community message promising transparency and fairness. She even invited everyone, not just board members, to a town hall. For the first time in years, people were excited to participate instead of afraid to exist. One morning, I found something to pet my front gate. My stomach tensed until I saw what it was. A handwritten note on floral stationery. Thank you for not backing down. You helped all of us. No name, just gratitude. I folded it and placed the same folder it once held every piece of evidence. Now it felt like a relic off a battle that had finally ended. A week later, I accepted Nain's offer and joined the liaison group. Not for power, but to make Sereno. One else got bullied again. The next meeting, people greeted me with nods, quiet thank yous. The room felt lighter, like fresh air after years of stale rules. Driving home, I saw kids paddling kayaks, families laughing by the shore. No megaphones, no warnings, just life happening as it should. When I pulled in my driveway, a group of teens were taking photos near the welcome sign. One pointed at my porch. That's the guy who kept the cabin locked. The others laughed, thumbs up. I waved back. Maybe that would be my legacy. The guy who kept his door locked and refused to hand over what was his. That night, I lit a fire, sat with a blanket and a book, listening to frogs and wind rustle the trees. For the first time in a long time, I slept with the windows open. The weeks that followed found a rhythm I didn't know I missed. With Marlene gone and the HOA rebooted, the lake finally breathed again. Mornings were quiet except birds and the soft drone of a distant boat. And one pacing my property line, and fake citations, and measuring tape at dawn. The land remembered it belonged to people who cared, not people who controlled. Silence felt like victory. One morning, on the dock, I found an envelope under a river stone. Inside was a photocopy of a check from Marlene's personal account. Someone named Dana Caldwell. Payment for fake 5-star cabin reviews and a note beside it. She paid people to boost the listing. And signed, but I recognized the handwriting. A board member who'd voted against her. I added it to the folder. Not out of spite, but to preserve the truth so no one forgot what almost happened here. That afternoon, the woman who tried to rent my cabin called. Her bank finished its fraud review and refunded her money. She thanked me, said she and her husband planned to return next season, this time to a real rental, and hoped to stop by and say hello. I told her she was welcome, but the cabin wasn't for rent. She laughed and said she wouldn't ask. She just wanted to see the famous porch where the HOA drama ended. The new board was proactive. They launched a monthly bulletin with actual resident input and removed Marlene's ridiculous rules that banned lawn flamingos, picnic benches, and tomato trellises over a certain height. Apparently, she hated the color red. Neighbors relaxed. Cabins got fresh paint in bright colors at a weekend art market returned, something she shut down years ago for being too informal. It was like the curtain finally lifted and people remembered how to live. I started keeping my gate open by day. Kids rode by and waved. Hikers asked before taking the shortcut, and I said yes if they respected the land. Respect, that was the difference. People asked now. They waved now. And every so often, someone said quietly that what I did made them feel heard again. Point one afternoon, a delivery truck dropped off a wooden sign I'd ordered long ago, a thick slab of oak carved with "Private Property Unlocked." Only for friends. I mounted it near the porch beside the flower bed Ruth helped replant. Not hostile, just a boundary and a reminder that kindness is not the same as permission. As summer stretched on, the lake welcomed visitors without chaos. The retreat ground still hosted events, but through a real, transparent system. The fake listings vanished, and violation notices appeared. For fun, I grew peppers and added a hand-painted sign. Not HOA approved. People loved it, took pictures even at a local inside joke. Point one. Weekend, the board invited me to speak at a community gathering. Just a short story about standing your ground. I hesitated, but Ruth encouraged me to I stood by the fire pit, surrounded by neighbors, and told them about the night someone tried to pry open my door, how it felt to be treated like a trespasser on your own land, and how victory didn't come from yelling or threats, but from patience, evidence, and a door that stayed locked no matter who demanded otherwise. When I finished, no one clapped. They simply nodded. And it meant more than applause. The strangest part was how quickly Marlene vanished from everyone's conversations, like a bad chapter no one wanted to reread. Rumors said she moved out of state, trying to start fresh in another community. But this time, people were asking questions. Her name had become a cautionary tale, not a threat, just a reminder. Point one night in early autumn, long after the tourists left and the leaves glowed red and gold, I sat alone by the fire pit. The lake was still, the air crisp. I thought back to that first morning when Marlene banged on my door like she owned the trees, the water, everything she could see, and I remembered standing there, half stunned, half angry, refusing to hand her a key to something that wasn't hers. That moment felt like a lifetime ago, yet it was the spark that started everything. The fire crackled, an owl called from the treetops, and I smiled, not in victory, but in peace. The cabin was still mine, the door was still locked, and the land was finally free from her shadow. Not because I shouted louder, but because I stood my ground when it mattered.